My mother-in-law convinced my husband to put the house in her name for tax purposes. She smirked, knowing she could throw me out any time. She'd remind me I was just a guest in her home. The day she tried to evict me, I handed her a folder. Inside were documents that proved she'd made one very expensive mistake. "Lindsay, darling, you've hung the hand towels wrong again." I froze in the doorway of what I'd foolishly believed was my bathroom, watching Diane refolding the cream-colored towels I'd just arranged 5 minutes earlier. Her manicured fingers worked with the precision of a surgeon, each fold crisp and deliberate, while she spoke without looking at me. "The decorative edge faces out, not in. I've shown you this 3 times now." 3 times. She was counting. Of course she was counting. When I married Adam 2 years ago, I thought I was building a life with the man I'd fallen desperately in love with. The gentle soul who brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning and left little notes in my lunch bag. What I didn't realize was that I'd also inherited a mother-in-law with a God complex and 27 years of practice wielding it like a weapon. "Sorry, Diane. I'll remember next time." The words tasted like sawdust in my mouth, but I'd learned that resistance only made things worse. She turned then, her pale blue eyes scanning my face for signs of defiance. Finding none, she smiled, that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Of course you will, sweetheart. We all have so much to learn when we're young." I was 31. He said it like I was 12. Diane Matthews ran her household like a monarch who'd never been questioned, never been challenged, never been told no by anyone who mattered. Everything had to be her way. From the specific Christmas china we used for holiday dinners to the exact route Adam took to work each morning to avoid unnecessary traffic. The morning Adam told me about the house transfer, I was standing in that same bathroom, brushing my teeth with the toothbrush she'd replaced because mine was the wrong brand for the holder. Through the mirror, I could see him in the bedroom, fidgeting with his tie, the blue one she'd bought him because it brings out your eyes better than that dreadful brown one. "Lindsay." His voice carried that particular tone I'd learned to dread, the one that meant he was about to deliver news that would change everything while pretending it changed nothing. I rinsed and turned, paste still foaming at the corner of my mouth. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mom's accountant thinks it would be better for tax purposes if we put the house in her name. Just temporarily. It'll save us thousands." The toothbrush slipped from my fingers, clattering against the marble sink. "Put our house in your mother's name? It's just paperwork, Lindsay. A legal technicality." He was using his reasonable voice, the one he employed when he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "She's trying to help us." Help us. Right. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab him by those perfectly pressed lapels and shake him until he saw what was happening. What had been happening since the day we moved in with his mother temporarily, while we looked for our own place. That was 18 months ago. Dad, I smiled. Nodded. Watched my husband choose his mother over his wife. "If you think it's best," I heard myself say. The relief that flooded his face was almost comical. Almost. Diane never raised her voice, she didn't need to. She had perfected the art of the surgical comment, the kind that sliced clean through your confidence and left you wondering if you were bleeding or just imagining the pain. "Some women marry up," she'd say, usually while arranging flowers or folding laundry, her tone as casual as if she were commenting on the weather. "Others just hang on." Or my personal favorite, delivered with a theatrical sigh, "Adam's always been so generous with strays." Strays. Like I was some mangy cat he'd found in an alley instead of the woman he'd proposed to on bended knee in front of his entire family. The warning signs had been there from the beginning. I'd just been too love-drunk to read them properly. Our wedding gifts, for instance. Beautiful, thoughtful presents from friends and family that somehow kept migrating around the house like they were searching for their purpose. The crystal vase from my college roommate appeared first on the dining room table, then the hallway console before finally settling on a bookshelf in the guest room. When I asked about it, Diane tilted her head with that practiced look of confusion. "Oh, sweetheart, it looks so much better there, don't you think? The light catches it beautifully." My grandmother's china, the set I'd treasured since I was 16, found itself relegated to the back of the highest cabinet, replaced by Diane's everyday dishes that cost more than my car payment. "We don't want to risk breaking something so precious," she'd said, patting my hand like I was a child who needed protection from sharp corners. Then there was the phone incident. I'd left my cell on the kitchen counter while I ran upstairs to grab a sweater. When I came back down, Diane was just hanging up, her expression serene. "Who was that?" I asked. "Oh, just someone asking for Lindsay Matthews." I told them there was no one here by that name. My maiden name. She told my own sister there was no Lindsay Matthews at this number. "Diane, that was probably my sister calling about." "Well, how was I supposed to know? You should really tell people to ask for Lindsay Porter if they want to reach you." Porter. Her name. The name I was supposed to have taken completely, erasing every trace of who I'd been before Adam. But it was her habit of planning Adam's schedule that really got under my skin. She'd coordinate his work meetings, arrange his dentist appointments, even RSVP to social events on his behalf, all without consulting me. Then she'd act genuinely surprised when I mentioned having other plans. "Oh dear, I already told the Hendersons we'd be at their anniversary party Saturday night. You don't mind, do you? Adam loves their parties." Did Adam love their parties? I honestly couldn't tell anymore what Adam loved versus what Diane had decided he should love. The morning after the house transfer conversation, I stood in the kitchen. Her kitchen, as I was beginning to understand, making coffee with hands that shook slightly. Adam had already left for work, kissing my forehead absently while Diane watched from the breakfast nook like a hawk observing mice. "More coffee, Mom?" he'd asked, not waiting for an answer before refilling her cup. She'd smiled at him with genuine warmth, the kind of smile I was beginning to realize she saved exclusively for him. "Thank you, darling. You're such a good son." The emphasis on son was subtle but unmistakable. A reminder that he was hers first, mine second. After he left, we sat in silence for exactly 4 minutes, I counted, before she spoke. "You know, Lindsay, I hope you understand how much Adam loves this house. It's been in our family for 3 generations. Our family. Not including me, apparently. His great-grandfather built the foundation with his own hands. His grandfather added the second story. His father and I renovated the kitchen." She gestured around the gleaming space with its granite countertops and custom cabinets. "Every Matthews man has raised his children here." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Adam would raise his children here too, but would I be the one raising them with him? "It's a beautiful house," I managed. "Yes." She sipped her coffee, studying me over the rim. "I'm sure you'll take very good care of it while you're here." "While I'm here?" "Not while we live here, or while you're part of the family. While I'm here. Temporary, conditional, subject to change without notice." That was the moment I realized I was truly alone in this marriage. Standing in what I'd thought was our kitchen. Her kitchen. While they discussed my future without consulting me, planned my life without including me, made decisions about my home without remembering that I lived there too. I excused myself and went upstairs to the bedroom Adam and I shared, closing the door carefully behind me. In the mirror above the dresser, I looked at the woman staring back, pale, tired, smaller somehow than she used to be. When had I become someone who smiled and nodded instead of speaking up? When had I started asking permission to exist in my own life? I didn't have answers yet. But looking at that woman in the mirror, I made a silent promise. I would find them. I just had no idea how much that promise would end up costing all of us. The answer to my silent promise came from the most unexpected source, and at the most unexpected time. It was 3 weeks after that bathroom confrontation, on a Thursday afternoon when the September sun painted everything golden. I was in Richard's garden, deadheading the roses he'd tended with religious devotion for the past 15 years. He'd been having what Diane called one of his good days, which meant he wasn't clutching his chest every time he stood up from his favorite armchair. I didn't expect him to join me outside. Richard Matthews was a man of quiet routines, and those routines had become even more rigid since his second heart attack 6 months earlier. Morning coffee at 7 sharp, afternoon medications at 2, evening news at 6. But there he was, walking slowly down the stone path, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea like he'd planned this moment. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said, settling onto the wrought iron bench with the careful movements of someone whose body had started betraying him. "Thank you." I accepted the glass, noting how his hands shook slightly, not from age but from the cocktail of medications that kept his damaged heart beating. "The roses are beautiful this year. That's all you." He smiled, and for a moment I saw where Adam had gotten his gentle eyes. "I haven't been much help lately." We sat in comfortable silence, watching bees work their way through the late-blooming flowers. This was how Richard and I had always communicated best. Without pressure, without performance, just two people who understood that sometimes the quiet said more than words. Lindsay. His voice was different suddenly, more serious. I need to tell you something. I turned to face him fully, struck by the intensity in his expression. He was studying my face like he was memorizing it, cataloging every detail. You're your father's daughter, he said finally. And that's the highest compliment I can give. My breath caught. Richard rarely mentioned my father, though I'd known they'd been friends. What I hadn't understood was the depth of that connection, how it had shaped the man sitting beside me and apparently how he saw me. Your dad and I served together in Vietnam. Did you know that? I shook my head, stunned. My father had never talked much about his military service, and I'd never thought to ask Richard about it. We were 19, scared out of our minds, convinced we were going to die in some jungle on the other side of the world. Richard's voice grew distant, traveling back decades. But we had each other's backs. Always. When I got hit by shrapnel, he touched his left shoulder absently. Your father carried me 2 miles to the medics. Saved my life. The ice cubes in my tea clinked as my hands trembled slightly. Dad never told me. He wouldn't have. That's who he was. Richard turned the glass in his hands, condensation dripping onto his khaki pants. When we came home, we started that construction business together. Matthews and Harrison, remember the sign? I did remember vaguely. A faded wooden sign in my father's garage that I'd seen as a child but never really noticed. We were going to build half the town together. Got married within 6 months of each other. I married Diane, he married your mother. We were going to be business partners, neighbors, watch our kids grow up together. What happened? Richard's expression darkened. Diane happened. She didn't like sharing me with anyone, including my best friend and business partner. Started making comments about your father's work ethic, his ideas, his family. Small things at first, then bigger ones. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This pattern was achingly familiar. She convinced me that he was taking advantage of our friendship, that I was doing all the work while he got equal credit. I was young and stupid and... He paused, shame flickering across his features. I was already learning it was easier to agree with Diane than to fight her. The construction business dissolved. My father started his own company. Richard kept the original name. They stopped speaking, stopped seeing each other, stopped being the brothers they'd been in that jungle. 32 years, Richard whispered. 32 years I let her convince me that my best friend was my enemy. I reached over and covered his weathered hand with mine. Dad never seemed bitter about it. No, he wouldn't have been. That wasn't his way. Richard smiled sadly. When he was dying, cancer wasn't it? He called me. First time we'd spoken in decades. My chest tightened. I remembered those final weeks, how my father had made mysterious phone calls from his hospital bed, conversations he'd claimed were just tying up loose ends. He didn't blame me for what happened. Said he understood how hard it was to stand up to her. But then he asked me something that's haunted me ever since. What? He asked me to watch out for you. Said you had his stubbornness but also his sense of justice. Said you'd need both with this family. Richard's voice broke slightly. He knew Lindsay. Even after all those years, he knew exactly what Diane was capable of. The garden blurred as tears filled my eyes. My father had seen this coming, had known I'd need protection in ways I couldn't even imagine yet. I promised him I would, Richard continued. But I didn't know how or when or even if you'd need it. You seemed so happy when you and Adam got engaged. So sure of yourself. I was. The words felt hollow now. I thought I was marrying into a family, not a battlefield. Richard was quiet for a long moment, watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder near the fence. When he spoke again, his voice was firmer, more resolved. She's going to try to push you out, you know. It's what she does. She can't stand competition for Adam's attention. And she certainly can't stand the thought of sharing control of this family. The house transfer is just the beginning. He turned to face me fully. Lindsay, I need you to listen carefully. I've been making some arrangements. Legal arrangements. Just in case. My heart began racing. What kind of arrangements? The kind your father would have made if he'd lived to see this. Richard reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a business card. Harold Brennan. He's been my attorney for 20 years and Diane doesn't know about half the work he does for me. I stared at the card, cream-colored, simple with just a name and phone number. I've been asking you about your career goals, your dreams because I needed to understand who you really are beyond what Diane sees. And what I see is exactly what your father predicted. Someone with backbone who just needs to remember she has it. The pieces began clicking together. The conversations we'd been having over the past few months, Richard's sudden interest in my thoughts about the future, the way he'd grown increasingly quiet during Diane's monologues at dinner. You've been planning something. I've been planning everything. His smile was grim but determined. Your father asked me to protect you and I failed him once already by letting Diane destroy our friendship. I won't fail him again. A breeze rustled through the roses, carrying the scent of autumn and change. Richard stood slowly, using the bench arm for support. Harold's expecting your call. Not today, not tomorrow, but when the time comes and you'll know when that is, call him. Tell him Richard sent you and tell him it's time to open the package. What package? But Richard was already walking back toward the house, moving with more purpose than I'd seen from him in months. Richard, wait. He paused at the garden gate, looking back at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the gentle, defeated man who'd learned to bend to his wife's will, but someone harder, more resolute. She thinks she's won, Lindsay. She thinks she's finally gotten everything she wanted. The house, Adam's complete loyalty, and you under her thumb. His smile was sharp as broken glass. She has no idea what's coming. That night, I lay awake staring at the business card I'd hidden in my jewelry box. Harold Brennan. A name I'd never heard before, representing possibilities I couldn't yet imagine. What I didn't know then was that Richard Matthews had been planning his final act of rebellion for months. A rebellion 32 years in the making, designed to honor a friendship Diane had destroyed and protect a daughter-in-law she was determined to break. I thought it was a kind goodbye from a man who'd always treated me like the daughter he never had. I had no idea it was the beginning of my safety net, or that the gentle, quiet man everyone underestimated was about to prove he'd been playing a much longer game than anyone realized. Richard's funeral was held on a Tuesday in October, under gray skies that seemed fitting for the somber occasion. The service was small, dignified, exactly what he would have wanted. I stood between Adam and Diane at the graveside, watching them lower the man who'd become my unexpected ally into the ground, and felt a profound loneliness settle over me like a shroud. Diane played the grieving widow perfectly. Black dress, modest heels, tissues dabbed delicately at her eyes at precisely the right moments. She accepted condolences with gracious nods and spoke in hushed tones about Richard's peaceful passing, and how blessed they'd been to have so many years together. I said nothing about our conversation in the garden. The business card Harold Brennan had given me remained hidden in my jewelry box, waiting. It didn't take long after the funeral for Diane to show her full hand. 6 weeks to be exact. Just long enough for the sympathy casseroles to stop arriving and the concerned phone calls from relatives to taper off. The transformation was subtle at first. She began referring to my house instead of our house in casual conversation. When her sister called to check on how she was adjusting to widowhood, I overheard Diane say, "Oh, I'm managing fine in my own space. It's actually quite liberating." My own space. Like I wasn't sitting 10 feet away, folding laundry in what she now considered her living room. Then came the bridge club. Diane had always hosted her Tuesday afternoon bridge games, but after Richard's death, they took on a different tone. Where once she'd introduced me as Adam's wife, Lindsay, I became Adam's wife who stays at home. Never by name, always by function, always with a slight emphasis that made it sound temporary. "Oh, this is Adam's wife," she'd say when Mrs. Henderson or Mrs. Chin asked about me. "She keeps herself busy around the house. Keeps herself busy." Like I was a pet with hobbies rather than a grown woman with a college degree and a career I'd put on hold to help care for Richard during his illness. The morning everything changed started like any other. Adam was rushing around the bedroom, packing for what Diane had termed an important business conference in Denver. I'd watched her plant the idea weeks earlier during one of their morning coffee chats. "You know, darling, that Morrison account would really benefit from some face-to-face attention. Didn't you say they were having their quarterly meeting next month?" Adam had looked surprised. "I hadn't really thought about attending in person. It's a week-long conference." "Oh, but think of the impression it would make. Your dedication, your commitment to client relationships." She'd reached across to pat his hand. I think it's exactly what your career needs right now. By the end of that conversation, Adam was convinced the Denver trip had been his idea. Now, watching him fold shirts with the distracted efficiency of someone whose mind was already elsewhere, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. You sure you'll be okay here with Mom? He asked, not really looking at me as he zipped up his garment bag. We'll be fine, I said, though something in my chest was screaming that we absolutely would not be fine. He kissed my forehead, a habit that had once felt loving but now seemed perfunctory, and headed downstairs. I heard him exchange goodbye pleasantries with Diane, heard the front door close, heard his car pull out of the driveway. The house fell silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I stayed upstairs for as long as I could, reorganizing my closet, cleaning the bathroom, anything to avoid going downstairs and facing whatever Diane had planned. But eventually the need for coffee drove me to the kitchen. He was waiting for me. Not obviously waiting. Diane was too clever for that. She was sitting at the breakfast table with her own cup of coffee and the morning newspaper spread out before her, the picture of casual normalcy. But there was something in her posture, something in the way she looked up when I entered, that told me this moment had been choreographed. Good morning, Lindsay. Sleep well. Fine, thank you. I moved to the coffee maker, hyper-aware of her eyes tracking my movements. I'm glad Adam made it off on time. That Morrison account is so important to his future. I poured coffee into my mug, the plain white one she'd relegated me to after deciding my favorite ceramic cup didn't match the kitchen aesthetic. Yes, I'm sure he'll do well. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken tension. I could feel something building, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. When I finally turned around, Diane was watching me with that practiced smile, the one that never reached her eyes. Why don't you sit down, dear? There's something we need to discuss. The coffee turned to ash in my mouth. I sat across from her at the table where I'd eaten hundreds of meals, trying to read the expression on her face. She folded the newspaper with deliberate precision, creating a neat rectangle beside her coffee cup. I've been doing a lot of thinking since Richard passed, she began, her voice conversational, almost friendly. About the future, about what I want my life to look like going forward. My hands wrapped around the coffee mug, absorbing its warmth. I've realized that I'm ready to reclaim my independence. This house has always been my sanctuary, and I think it's time I enjoyed it on my own terms again. He paused, waiting for me to respond. When I didn't, that smile grew wider, more confident. I need you out by the weekend. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though some part of me had been expecting them for weeks. The coffee mug trembled slightly in my grip. Excuse me. I've already contacted a moving company. They're very professional. They'll be here Saturday morning to help you pack your things. She delivered this information like she was discussing the weather, casual and matter-of-fact. I thought that would be easier for everyone involved. My mind reeled. Diane, you can't just. Of course I can, sweetheart. The endearment dripped with false sweetness. It's my house now, remember? Richard left it to me, and with the transfer Adam signed, I have complete control over who lives here. She leaned back in her chair, and there it was, that smug grin I'd learned to dread. The expression she wore when she was about to deliver what she considered a killing blow. I'm sure you understand. A widow needs her privacy, her space to grieve properly. Having you here, well. She gestured vaguely as if my presence was somehow offensive. It's just not appropriate anymore. Where exactly do you expect me to go? I'm sure a resourceful girl like you will figure something out. Perhaps your sister in Colorado? Or maybe it's time to reconnect with your mother's family back east. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. She'd thought this through, planned every detail. The timing, when Adam was 3 states away and unreachable during his conference sessions. The movers, already booked before she'd even told me. The suggestions about where I might go, anywhere but here, anywhere that would make it difficult for Adam to find me when he returned. I should call Adam, I said, reaching for my phone. Oh, I wouldn't want to interrupt his important meetings, Diane said smoothly. You know how focused he gets during these conferences. Besides, this is really between you and me, isn't it? Between you and me. Like I was a problem to be solved rather than Adam's wife. I'm sure when you explain it to him, he'll understand completely. After all, you wouldn't want to force yourself on a grieving widow, would you? Her voice carried just the right note of wounded dignity. That would be rather selfish. I stared at her across the table, this woman who'd orchestrated my isolation with the precision of a chess master. Every move had been calculated, from convincing Adam to put the house in her name to arranging his convenient absence, from establishing legal control to positioning herself as the sympathetic victim. But as I sat there absorbing the full scope of her manipulation, something unexpected happened. Instead of the crushing defeat she was clearly expecting, I felt something else entirely. Clarity. Cold, sharp, crystalline clarity. My hands stopped shaking. My voice steadied. 27 years of her training had taught me not to give her the satisfaction of a visible reaction, but this was different. This wasn't surrender. This was the moment Richard had been preparing me for. If that's what you want, I heard myself say, surprising us both with how calm I sounded. Diane blinked, clearly taken aback by my composure. She'd been expecting tears, pleas, maybe even anger she could use against me later. Instead, I was giving her nothing. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this," she said, though something in her expression suggested she found my reasonableness more unsettling than satisfying. "Can I ask for one thing?" "Of course, dear. I'd like to gather my personal belongings peacefully. No interference, no commentary. Just let me pack what's mine." She nodded, perhaps relieved that I wasn't going to make a scene. "Naturally. I'm not unreasonable, Lindsay. I just think this arrangement will be better for everyone." I stood up from the table, leaving my coffee unfinished. "I'll start this afternoon." As I walked toward the stairs, I heard her say almost to herself, "I'm finally getting my house back." My house. Not our house, not the family home, her house. What Diane didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that I was about to make one phone call that would change everything. Harold Brennan was expecting to hear from me. And Richard Matthews was about to have the last word after all. I walked upstairs with measured steps, my hand trailing along the mahogany banister Richard had restored himself 20 years ago. Each step felt deliberate, purposeful, like I was climbing toward something instead of away from it. The bedroom Adam and I shared had never really felt like mine. Even after 2 years of marriage, it still carried the ghost of his childhood, high school trophies on the dresser, a framed photo of him and Diane at his college graduation prominently displayed on the nightstand. My belongings had always seemed like visitors in this space, tolerated but not truly welcome. I opened the walk-in closet and pushed past the winter coats Diane had insisted I store in the back because darker colors create visual clutter. Behind them, exactly where I'd hidden it 3 days after Richard's death, was the small fireproof box I'd purchased with cash from the hardware store downtown. The combination was my father's birthday, something Richard had suggested with a knowing smile when he'd given me the folder. "Your dad would appreciate the symbolism," he'd said. Inside the box, beneath my passport and birth certificate, lay the simple black folder that had been waiting for this exact moment. I remembered the afternoon Richard had pressed it into my hands, just 3 days before his final heart attack. He'd looked frielier than usual, his skin gray with exhaustion, but his eyes had been sharp and determined. "Only if she tries to hurt you, Lindsay. Only then," he'd whispered, glancing toward the house where Diane was preparing his afternoon medications. "Promise me you'll wait for the right moment." I'd promised, not fully understanding what I was agreeing to protect. Now, holding the folder in my hands, I felt the weight of his final gift, not just the documents inside, but the trust he'd placed in me to use them wisely. I walked back downstairs, my footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet of the house. Diane was still in the kitchen, probably savoring her victory, already mentally rearranging the furniture to erase any trace of my presence. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway, folder in hand. For just a moment, something flickered across her face, curiosity, maybe even concern, but it was quickly replaced by her practiced composure. "Decided to be dramatic about this, have we?" she said, though her voice carried less confidence than her words suggested. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked to the granite island she'd spent thousands renovating 2 years ago, the same island where she'd served me my final ultimatum. I set the folder down gently, my fingers lingering on its edge. "You should probably look this over before you toss me out," I said, my voice steady as glass. Diane's perfectly plucked eyebrows drew together. "What kind of game are you playing, Lindsay?" "No game." I stepped back, crossing my arms. "Just some light reading." She stared at the folder like it might contain something dangerous. Which I supposed it did. I don't have time for whatever theatrical nonsense this is supposed to be. Make time. Something in my tone must have gotten through to her because she reached for the folder with the tentative movements of someone approaching a sleeping snake. Her manicured fingers, always perfectly maintained even in widowhood, hesitated at the edge. Richard asked me to give this to you, I lied smoothly. Consider it his final gift. That got her attention. Diane had always been sensitive about Richard's final wishes, perhaps because she suspected he'd seen through her more clearly than he'd ever let on. She opened the folder with the careful precision she applied to everything in her life. The first document was a legal agreement, typed on cream-colored letterhead from Harold Brennan's law office. I watched her eyes scan the opening paragraph, then freeze. Her lips moved slightly as she read, as if she couldn't quite believe the words in front of her. This is... She started then stopped. Started again. This can't be legal. Trust agreement executed 2 months before Richard's death, I said conversationally. Giving me 44% ownership of all real estate and business holdings, including this house, the rental properties on Elm Street, and that little commercial building downtown where the florist and the insurance office rent space. Her hands were shaking now just slightly. She flipped to the next page, searching for some loophole, some technicality that would make this go away. Instead, she found Richard's letter. I couldn't see the words from where I stood, but I knew them by heart. Richard had read them to me that final afternoon, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. Diane has forgotten that family means all of us, not just the ones who share her blood. Lindsay has shown more grace and kindness in 2 years than some people manage in a lifetime. If you're reading this, it means she needs protection and I failed to provide it while I was alive. This is my attempt to right that wrong. Diane's face went through a fascinating transformation as she read. Confusion first, her head tilting slightly to the side like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Then disbelief, her eyes widening as the implications sank in. Then something darker, more dangerous. He couldn't have done this without my knowledge, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Apparently he could. Apparently he did. She flipped to the third document, the email thread where she'd pressured Adam into the house transfer. I'd wondered how Richard had gotten access to those communications until I remembered that he'd helped Adam set up his email account years ago and probably still had the password. Her face flushed as she read her own words back to herself. I need insurance against her in case things don't work out. The house is the perfect leverage. This is private correspondence, she said weakly. Private correspondence that proves you coerced Adam into signing over the house specifically to use against me. I stepped closer to the island, close enough to see the slight tremor in her hands. That's called fraud, Diane. Or at the very least, undue influence. She was flipping through pages now with increasing desperation, looking for something, anything that would restore her advantage. Instead, she found the transcript of her phone conversation with her sister Margaret, the one Richard had recorded from the extension in his study. I'm finally going to get rid of that little gold digger. Once Adam's in Denver, I'll give her the boot. She can crawl back to whatever trailer park she came from. The color drained from Diane's face as she read her own words. She looked up at me with something approaching fear. How did you get this? Richard was more observant than you gave him credit for. I leaned against the counter, feeling strangely calm. Turns out he'd been documenting your behavior for months. The recordings, the emails, even photos of you going through my personal belongings when you thought no one was watching. That last part was a bluff. There were no photos, but Diane's guilty flinch told me I'd hit close to home. You can't prove any of this holds up in court, she said, but she was grasping now. Maybe not all of it. But the trust agreement? That's ironclad. Richard made sure of that. I pulled out my phone and showed her Harold Brennan's contact information. I called his attorney this morning. Fascinating conversation. Diane stared at the phone screen like it was showing her own death warrant. Turns out Richard had been planning this for a while. Ever since you convinced Adam to put the house in your name, actually. He knew exactly what you were trying to do and he made sure you couldn't do it. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, the folder clutched in her hands like a life preserver that had turned out to be an anchor. This ruins everything, she whispered. No, I corrected gently. This ruins your plan to destroy me. There's a difference. For the first time since I'd known her, Diane Matthews looked genuinely defeated. The mask of composed superiority had slipped completely, revealing something smaller and more frightened underneath. "What do you want?" she asked. It was a fair question. What did I want? Revenge would have been satisfying, but as I looked at this woman who'd tried so hard to erase me, I realized I wanted something much simpler. "I want you to understand that you don't get to decide who belongs in this family," I said. Richard already made that decision. And apparently he chose me. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of that grandfather clock and the soft rustle of papers as Diane's hands continued to shake. Outside, storm clouds were gathering and I could smell rain in the air. The reckoning Richard had promised was finally here. The storm clouds that had been gathering finally broke open, sending sheets of rain against the kitchen windows. Thunder rolled across the sky like an ominous soundtrack to Diane's unraveling composure. She stared at the folder for another long moment before reaching for her phone with trembling fingers. The device slipped twice before she managed to unlock it, her usually precise movements clumsy with shock. "I need to speak with James immediately," she said when someone answered. Her voice cracked on the word immediately, the first time I'd ever heard Diane Matthews sound anything less than completely in control. I walked to the tea kettle more for something to do than because I wanted tea. The familiar ritual of filling it with water, setting it on the burner, gave me time to process what was happening. 27 years of Diane's psychological warfare, and she'd just been checkmated by her own husband. "James, it's Diane Matthews. I need you to look at something immediately. No, it can't wait until Monday. Because my dead husband apparently executed a trust agreement that gives my daughter-in-law 44% of everything I own." Her voice rose with each word, the careful modulation she'd perfected over decades finally cracking. I could hear a man's voice on the other end, calm and professional, asking questions she clearly didn't want to answer. "I don't know when he did it. I don't know how he did it. That's what I'm paying you to figure out." The kettle began to whistle, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the tension. I turned off the burner and prepared 2 cups of tea, Earl Grey for me, chamomile for her. Muscle memory even in crisis. Even in the middle of a war, some courtesies persisted. I set the chamomile in front of Diane just as she was saying, "Fine. Bring the documents. Bring everything. I'll be here." She ended the call and stared at her phone like it had personally betrayed her. "Your attorney's coming over?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her. "James Whitfield. He's been handling our legal affairs for 15 years. She picked up the teacup with both hands to stop the trembling. "He helped me with the house transfer. He should have known about this. This conspiracy." Conspiracy. Interesting word choice. "Maybe Richard used a different attorney for the trust," I suggested mildly. "Richard didn't use attorneys without telling me. We discussed everything." But even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice. "We always discussed everything." The first crack in her certainty. I filed it away. We sat in uncomfortable silence for the next hour, rain drumming against the windows while Diane alternated between staring at the documents and glaring at me like I'd personally orchestrated Richard's rebellion from beyond the grave. When the doorbell rang, she practically leaped from her chair. James Whitfield looked exactly like Central Casting would order for expensive attorney. Silver hair, expensive suit, briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was also, I noticed immediately, deeply uncomfortable. "Diane." He kissed her cheek with the practiced familiarity of long association. His eyes found mine across the room. "Mrs. Matthews." "This is Lindsay," Diane said curtly. "The one Richard apparently decided to enrich at my expense." "Yes." Whitfield's discomfort deepened. "I've had a chance to review the documents you described over the phone. And..." He set his briefcase on the kitchen island, popped it open with sharp clicks. "I'm afraid they're legitimate." The word, legitimate, hit Diane like a physical blow. She actually swayed on her feet. "That's impossible. Richard couldn't have executed a trust of this magnitude without my knowledge. We shared everything." "Apparently not everything." Whitfield pulled out a thick folder of his own. "I did some investigating after your call. Richard retained Harold Brennan approximately 6 months ago for what Brennan described as estate planning matters. 6 months ago. Right around the time Adam and I had signed the house transfer papers." "Brennan." Diane's voice was hollow. "I've never heard of him." He's quite reputable. Specializes in complex estate structures and... Whitfield paused delicately. Family protection strategies. Family protection strategies. I almost smiled at the euphemism. The trust is ironclad, Diane. Richard clearly had competent counsel and everything was executed properly. Witnesses, notarization, proper filing, it's all there. But surely there's something we can do. A challenge based on diminished capacity or undue influence or... I wouldn't recommend that path. Whitfield's tone turned grave. The trust contains a no-contest clause. Anyone who challenges it forfeits their entire share. Richard was thorough. Diane sank back into her chair, the fight draining out of her like air from a punctured balloon. What does this mean practically speaking? She asked. Whitfield consulted his notes. It means Mrs. Matthews, Lindsay, owns 44% of all real estate and business assets that were part of Richard's estate. The house, the rental properties on Elm Street, the commercial building downtown. And if I want her out of my house? It's not just your house anymore. He glanced apologetically at me. She has rights as a co-owner. If you can't reach an agreement. Partition sale, I said quietly. Both of them looked at me. I could file for a partition sale. Force the sale of the properties and split the proceeds according to ownership percentages. Whitfield nodded slowly. That would be within your rights. Diane's face went ashen. You'd force me to sell my home? I'd prefer not to. But if you insist on trying to evict me... I shrugged. I have options now. The irony was perfect. By putting the house in her name to gain control over me, Diane had created the very mechanism Richard needed to protect me. The transfer that was supposed to make me powerless had become the foundation of my power. How much would it cost to buy her out? Diane asked. Whitfield consulted his phone, probably checking recent property values. Given current market rates, probably close to $800,000. Cash. $800,000. I watched Diane's face as the number sank in. I don't have that kind of liquidity, she whispered. You could mortgage the properties, Whitfield suggested. Or liquidate some of your other investments. The tax consequences alone would be ruinous. Diane's financial acumen was finally working against her. And the properties have appreciated so much since Richard bought them. The capital gains would eat me alive. She was trapped. Richard had constructed an elegant financial prison, using her own greed as the bars. The tax advantages she'd been so eager to exploit had become tax burdens she couldn't escape. Her insistence on controlling everything had made her vulnerable to losing everything. There is one other option, Whitfield said carefully. What? Negotiate. Mrs. Matthews owns 44%, but she doesn't have to exercise her rights immediately. Perhaps some kind of accommodation could be reached. Diane looked at me across the table, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something approaching respect in her eyes. Or maybe it was just fear. What do you want? She asked. It was the same question she'd asked an hour ago, but the context had completely changed. Then she'd been trying to minimize damage. Now she was negotiating from a position of weakness. I want to stay in my home, I said simply. I want to be treated like a member of this family instead of an unwelcome guest. And I want you to stop trying to manipulate my husband against me. And if I agree to those terms, then I won't file for partition sale. We can work out some kind of arrangement that lets you keep living here too. The rain had stopped while we were talking. Afternoon sunlight was starting to break through the clouds, casting everything in a golden glow that seemed almost prophetic. Diane stared out the window for a long moment, watching water drip from the eaves of the house her great-grandfather had built. Richard knew exactly what he was doing, didn't he? She said finally. Yes, I said. I think he did. She turned back to me and I saw a woman who'd just realized she'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing a completely different game. He was always smarter than I gave him credit for, she admitted quietly. For the first time in our relationship, Diane Matthews had just told me the truth about something that mattered. It felt like the beginning of a very different kind of conversation. That beginning of a different conversation never quite materialized the way I'd hoped. Over the following weeks, Diane and I existed in a strange kind of détente. She stopped making snide comments about my presence in her house, but she also stopped making any comments to me at all. We moved around each other like polite strangers sharing a hotel lobby, cordial but distant, each acutely aware of the shifted power dynamic but unsure how to navigate it. James Whitfield drew up a temporary agreement that allowed us both to remain in the house while we figured out a more permanent arrangement. I kept to the upstairs, she claimed the main floor as her domain. We shared the kitchen in shifts, she took mornings, I took evenings. It was civilized and completely unsustainable. Adam returned from Denver 3 days after our confrontation, rolling his suitcase through the front door with the easy confidence of a man who expected his world to be exactly as he'd left it. I was in the living room when he walked in, reading a book I couldn't have described if someone had asked me, and I watched his face as he took in the subtle changes. Diane wasn't waiting to greet him at the door. The house felt different somehow, quieter, more cautious. And I was sitting in the chair that had always been unspoken claimed as hers. "How was the trip?" I asked, closing the book on my finger. "Good. Productive." He set down his suitcase and looked around the room like he was seeing it for the first time. "Where's Mom?" "In her study." He waited for me to elaborate. When I didn't, he sat on the edge of the couch, suddenly looking uncertain. "Is everything okay? You seem different." "Different? Supposed I was." "We need to talk," I said. I told him everything. Not the version I might have told a week earlier, careful and diplomatic, cushioned with concern for his feelings, but the truth. All of it. The years of manipulation, the calculated cruelty, the house transfer that had been designed to control me, and finally Richard's extraordinary posthumous protection. Adam listened in silence, his face cycling through disbelief, denial, and finally a kind of sick recognition. He'd known on some level. He'd always known. "I can't believe she actually tried to evict you," he said when I finished. "Can't you?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I always told myself she was just particular, set in her ways. I thought if I could just keep the peace between you two." "You were trying to keep her happy at my expense." "Yes." The admission came out barely above a whisper. "I was." We talked for hours that night, the kind of conversation we should have had years earlier. Adam cried, actually cried, when I showed him the recorded transcript of his mother calling me a gold digger. He'd never heard her speak about me that way, never seen the woman she became when he wasn't watching. But knowing the truth and knowing how to live with it were different things entirely. The next few weeks were awkward and strained. Adam tried to play peacemaker, suggesting family dinners and movie nights like we could somehow pretend our way back to normal. Diane participated with the enthusiasm of someone attending a funeral. I went along with it because I didn't know what else to do. It was during one of these painful attempts at family harmony that I found the photo. I was looking for a spare phone charger in Richard's old study, a room Diane had avoided since his death, when I pulled open the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. Inside were the usual detritus of a man's life. Old business cards, reading glasses with scratched lenses, a small stack of photographs held together with a rubber band. Most of the photos were what you'd expect. Family gatherings, holiday celebrations, Adam's graduation from college. But near the bottom of the stack was one I'd never seen before. It was from my wedding day, but not one of the formal shots the photographer had taken. This was candid, unposed. Richard and me standing together during the reception, both of us laughing at something just out of frame. His arm was around my shoulders in a gesture that was purely paternal, protective. We looked like what we'd become, a father and the daughter he'd chosen. I turned the photo over and found Richard's careful handwriting on the back, in the blue ink he'd always preferred. Asterisk, she earned the Matthews name, Diane. You never did. Asterisk. I stared at those words for a long time, sitting in his leather chair that still smelled faintly of his cologne. This wasn't a message he'd written for me to find. This was a message he'd written for her. A final judgment from the man who'd spent 32 years watching her transform love into control, family into battlefield. That evening I made a decision. I found Diane in the kitchen, preparing her usual solitary dinner of grilled chicken and steamed vegetables. She looked up when I entered, her expression guarded. "I'm leaving," I told her. Something flickered across her face. Relief, maybe, or possibly regret. "Where will you go?" "I'm buying a condo downtown, near the park." I'd made the offer that afternoon, using the equity from my share of the house as collateral. "I'll be out by the weekend." She nodded slowly. "And the arrangement?" "The legal situation. I'll sign whatever James draws up." You can buy me out over time, reasonable payments. I'm not interested in forcing a sale anymore. Why? The question seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised me. I thought about Richard's photo, about the years of small kindnesses he'd shown me, about the way he'd protected me even in death. Because Richard wouldn't have wanted me to destroy his family, even to save myself. He would have wanted me to be better than that. I placed the envelope containing the photograph on the counter between us. This is for you. From him. Diane stared at the envelope like it might bite her. When she finally opened it and saw the photo, her face went through the same transformation I'd witnessed weeks earlier. But this time, there was something else mixed in with the shock. Something that looked almost like shame. She read the words on the back, and I watched 27 years of carefully constructed self-image crumble in an instant. Not the family matriarch she'd styled herself as, but a woman who'd confused control with love for so long she'd forgotten the difference. He really did see everything, didn't he? She whispered. Yes. I think he did. She looked up at me then, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw the woman she might have been without all the armor. Smaller, more frightened, but also more human. I'm sorry, she said. I'm sorry for all of it. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that we could start over, that forgiveness was possible. But some things couldn't be undone with apologies, no matter how sincere they seemed. I know, I said instead. But some bridges can't be rebuilt, Diane. Some trust can't be repaired. I left her sitting in that kitchen, holding the photograph that contained her late husband's final verdict on their marriage. It felt like the most honest conversation we'd ever had. 3 days later, I packed my belongings. Really packed them this time, not the hasty evacuation she'd once demanded. Adam helped me load boxes into a rented truck, both of us crying a little as we worked. I keep thinking if I'd just stood up to her earlier. He said as we carried my grandmother's china to the truck. We all have things we wish we'd done differently. But as I drove away from the house that had never quite felt like home, I realized I didn't have as many regrets as I'd expected. Richard had taught me something valuable in those final months. That sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait for the right moment, that patience could be its own form of power. The condo I'd bought was small but bright, with windows that faced east toward the sunrise. I hung Richard's garden photo, the one of us with the roses, in the living room where I could see it every morning. Kept his name too. Matthews suited me better than I'd ever imagined. And somewhere, in whatever place fathers go when their work on earth is done, I believed Richard Matthews was finally at peace, knowing he'd kept his promise to watch over me after all. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came an unexpected phone call. Lindsay? It's Adam. I paused in my morning routine. Coffee brewing, NPR murmuring from the kitchen radio, sunlight streaming through windows that were finally, truly mine. We'd spoken exactly twice since the divorce papers were signed, both conversations awkward and brief. How are you? I asked, settling into the chair by my east-facing window. Good. Better, actually. I wanted you to know, Mom's selling the house. That surprised me. Really? She says it's too big for one person. Too many ghosts. He was quiet for a moment. She found a nice apartment in that senior community near the lake. Downsizing, she calls it. Downsizing. More like right-sizing finally. She asked me to give you something before the house sells. Dad's garden tools. She thought you'd want them. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Richard's tools. The ones he'd used to tend those roses, to teach me that beautiful things required patience and care. I'd like that very much. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory for two people learning to be friends after failing to be married. Adam looked better than I'd seen him in years. Lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying weight he hadn't realized. I've been seeing someone, he said as we sat with our drinks. A therapist. Trying to understand how I let things get so bad. That's good, Adam. Really? She says I have to stop trying to fix everyone else's problems and start fixing my own. He smiled ruefully. Apparently I have commitment issues with my own happiness. It was the most self-aware thing I'd ever heard him say. For what it's worth, I said, you're a good man who got caught between two strong women. That's not entirely your fault. Maybe. But choosing sides instead of choosing truth, that was my fault. We talked for an hour, easy conversation between two people who'd finally stopped trying to force something that wasn't meant to be. When we hugged goodbye in the parking lot, it felt like forgiveness. Not just his for me or mine for him, but both of us forgiving the people we'd been when we didn't know better. That evening, I planted Richard's rose bushes in the small garden behind my condo. The previous owner had left raised beds that were perfect for them, almost like he'd known they were coming. As I worked the soil with Richard's well-worn spade, I thought about the woman I'd been 18 months ago, so eager to belong somewhere that I'd forgotten I already belonged to myself. I thought about Diane, learning to live in a space sized for one person instead of an empire. I thought about Adam, finally brave enough to look at his own reflection instead of just his mother's approval. Mostly, though, I thought about Richard and the quiet revolution he'd orchestrated from beyond the grave. Not with anger or vengeance, but with the patient certainty that truth, given enough time, always finds its way to the surface. The roses would bloom again this summer. Different soil, different light, but the same essential beauty. Some things once planted with love never really die. They just find new places to grow. If this story of quiet justice had you on the edge of your seat, press that like button right now. My favorite part was when Lindsay calmly handed Diane that black folder and watched her entire world crumble in real time. What was your favorite moment? Was it Richard's secret garden conversation? The moment Diane tried to evict Lindsay? Or maybe when that attorney confirmed Lindsay owned 44% of everything? Drop your favorite scene in the comments below. Don't miss more incredible stories of karma and justice like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload when someone gets exactly what they deserve.